I first played Metroid 2 Return of Samus when it released on the 3DS Virtual Console in 2011, almost exactly 20 years after its release on the original Game Boy. And as much as I enjoyed finally seeing this mysterious game with my own eyes, I didn't like it very much and didn't have plans to return to it. Since then, I've familiarized myself with the game's structure and significance to the overarching Metroid story, but after trying it out again recently, I still don't enjoy playing it. Gameplay-wise, it is a step up from the original Metroid, notably being able to aim upwards and downwards in midair, in addition to having save points instead of a password system. And while these updates are welcome, the lack of an in-game map and the tediousness of farming for health do hinder the experience. Though it does provide an additional layer of tension on top of the labyrinthine layout of SR388, and the mostly ambient soundtrack. Overall, I appreciate the vibe Metroid 2 went for, even if I think its execution as a whole leaves something to be desired. I really want to like it, but whenever I sit down to play it, I just can't shake this feeling that I'd rather be doing something else. So when a remake was announced for release in 2017, I was looking forward to how they might modernize it for players like me who couldn't seem to get into the original. I am very much aware of another Metroid 2 remake, or AM2R, and I would like to try it out at some point, but it's just not a priority at the moment. I also want to judge Samus Returns on its own merits, as opposed to doing yet another comparison video on these two remakes. I first played Metroid Samus Returns when it launched in the fall of 2017, and enjoyed my time with it. It had been a while since a traditional Metroid game had released, and I even went so far as to 100% it. Apparently. The fact that I didn't even remember doing this just a few years ago reaffirms my thoughts on my initial playthrough, being that it was a solid game, but didn't quite stand out to me compared to other first-party 3DS games or even other games in the franchise. I was nonetheless interested to revisit it, so I could try and break down what it is I do and don't like so much about this remake. The playthrough I did for the sake of this video was done on an emulator with remapped controls that don't require the direct use of the touchscreen. My thoughts on this control scheme are twofold. One is that it's quite satisfying once you familiarize yourself with what everything does, since every button on the controller is used once you reach a certain point in the game. However, because the game wasn't made with this control scheme in mind, this did lead to some frustrating moments and misinputs, though this became less of an issue the more I played due to increasing familiarity with the control scheme. If you're interested in trying this control scheme out for yourself, I will leave a link in the description below. It can be a little tricky to set up, so if there's enough demand, I'll consider doing a video tutorial on it. With all that out of the way, let's move on to the game itself. Following the events of the first game, the Galactic Federation deemed the Metroid species too dangerous to be left alive. So they decided to send a research team to SR388 to exterminate the parasitic menace. And in typical sci-fi fashion, a distress signal is received from the Squad of No-Names, leaving the Federation no choice but to appoint resident badass Samus Aran to the task of wiping out the Metroids once and for all. Metroid 2 and Samus Returns are structured a bit differently than the usual Metroid game. Progression from area to area is linear, with the areas themselves acting as more traditional Metroid locations. Find an obstacle that requires a certain upgrade, find the upgrade that allows you to pass it, and so on. Of course, as the exposition of the game suggests, you'll be hunting down Metroids in addition to the typical formula. Clearing the Metroids in a given area lowers the acid, or lava, or whatever you want to call it, that was preventing your descent, allowing you to delve deeper into this infested planet. I will say that the original Metroid 2 retains a semblance of mystery in each area, not giving you the specific number of Metroids you need to find, adding to that unsettling feeling of isolation. But I also like the way that Samus Returns handled progression from area to area, providing a lock mechanism that requires a certain amount of Metroid DNA to open. From a lore perspective, it makes sense, as the Chozo were the ones to create the Metroids in the first place to combat the X-Parasite. Letting the lower levels where the more dangerous variants of Metroids reside, and requiring the elimination of said Metroids to proceed is a logical safety measure. It could have been nice to keep the specific amount of DNA per area ambiguous, but it doesn't bug me that much. Maybe it could have at least been a difficulty option that isn't paywalled behind a figure that now goes for several times the original MSRP. Now, this is a topic for another day, but I wish more thought was put into difficulty options in games other than just, now you take big damage, enemy take no damage. Anyway, as far as the progression in the areas themselves, I'm not a big fan of how Samus Returns handles its item gating, particularly in the first few areas. Perhaps I wasn't as thorough as I could have been in Area 2 for instance, but it seemed like whenever I found an obstacle blocking my path, it was hard for me to tell if there was an upgrade I had missed, or if there was just some hidden entrance through a breakable wall I hadn't uncovered. This made the area feel much less flexible as far as the order of tasks I needed to accomplish, because you need Spring Ball to access one specific Metroid, and you need High Jump to access a specific other Metroid, and so on. Maybe if the area was less expansive to accommodate this, and didn't have an area in the middle with only one exit, via loading elevator no less, I have no doubt this area would be less frustrating to get through. I really do think Samus Returns is a game that gets better and more enjoyable the further you get. For example, Area 5 is structured in a similar way as Area 2, with several different upgrades needed to access certain areas. I don't know if the barriers were telegraphed better, or if it's just because I had more options at my disposal, but this area felt less frustrating than Area 2 did, despite the level design similarities. Regarding the upgrades themselves, a lot of old favorites return with a few additions, mostly in the form of the new Aeon powers. These abilities utilize a gauge that can be replenished by enemy drops and some set spots throughout the map. There's Scan Pulse, which reveals parts of the map around you and is completely optional to use, though I did accidentally activate it a good number of times as I was getting used to the control scheme. Lightning Armor nullifies physical damage and increases the range of melee counters apparently, but I never made use of this during my playthrough. Beam Burst is the one I use most often by a long shot, and it's essentially a powerful, rapid-fire beam that can break through certain otherwise invulnerable enemies and obstacles. Last and least, there's Phase Drift, which is basically a slow time ability. This is only required a few times, and I actually got stuck at one of these points because I forgot it existed. Never bothered to use it in combat over Beam Burst, but I'm sure it has its uses. On to the main event of the game, which is the Metroid fights themselves. I think these fights, and the boss fights in general, are where this game really shines. Particularly the later Metroid variants that require a range of weapons in your arsenal to take down, and have some really badass melee counter animations that you can actually still attack during, which I failed to take advantage of a few times since I'm so used to animations like that being purely cinematic. Though this does bring me to one of the more contentious additions to Samus Returns, being the aforementioned melee counter. While I do like the way this move is integrated into the boss fights, there is a seeming over-reliance on this counter move in the regular enemy encounters. Enemy variety in general isn't too different from Area 1 to the very end of the game, but until you get access to more powerful beam upgrades, regular enemy encounters can feel tedious. Something I forgot to mention is that the wall jump in Samus Returns was changed from previous 2D Metroid titles. Since this game gives you Spider Ball early on and doesn't have a lot of places to use the wall jump, it didn't bug me too much during my playthrough, but the few times that I did wall jump, it just felt wrong. I personally find the wall jump from older 2D Metroid titles immensely satisfying to pull off, and would love a Metroid game that utilizes it more deliberately, or maybe even a hard mode that removes parts of the environment requiring the wall jump to traverse. I know the original wall jump wasn't a very beginner-friendly maneuver, but I do hope this change doesn't remain in 2D Metroid games going forward, or at least if they could give players the option between the new, simpler wall jump and the original one. There's not much else I want to mention aside from the very end portion of the game, so if you want to avoid spoilers, I'll leave a timestamp so you can skip this part. So after you defeat the Metroid Queen, you discover, which decides to follow Samus to the end of the game, clearing previously unbreakable blocks on your way back to the ship, same as the original. The only difference this time is you are able to fast travel to previous areas to go for 100% if you choose to do so. During this sequence, an unusually uplifting tune plays, but I could hardly hear it over the damn sound effects. Most of Samus Returns' soundtrack airs on the side of ambient and atmospheric, so I didn't really notice the balance until this moment. It is kind of a nitpick, but it's something I had to mention because there are no audio balancing options in this game. I am usually the type to lower sound effects a notch or two in most games though, so maybe it's not as much of an issue as I'm making it out to be. I just thought I'd mention it since it essentially nullified what is supposed to be an impactful moment in the game and really the franchise as a whole. Once you make it outside on the surface of SR388, the weather has turned stormy and grim, reflecting the genocide Samus just performed, and also foreshadowing something that was legitimately surprising my first time playing. I'm of course referring to the sudden Ridley fight as you're about to board your ship. I think because it had been so long since a quality Metroid title released, the addition of Ridley still strikes me as a cool bit of fan service, and he's not a pushover either. Beam Burst is your friend. but I do think adding something so bombastic and heroic to cap off a game whose ending is otherwise melancholy loses the point a bit. If Samus Returns had come out closer to Prime 3 or even Other M, I would say the presence of Ridley in Samus Returns is egregious. But that's just not how I feel about it, given Samus Returns served as both a remake of Metroid 2 and a return to form for a franchise that had seemingly been forgotten. Again, overall, I'd say Samus Returns is not as consistent or as tight of an experience as the other 2D Metroid games, but I do think it's still a solid game in its own right. It's pretty slow paced at first, but I'd say if you can push past the first few areas, the rest of the game makes up for it. As much as I enjoyed replaying it, perhaps I'll finally see what AM2R is all about when I decide to play these games back to back again. Until then, consider leaving a like and subscribing if you enjoyed, check out my second channel where I upload most of my Twitch streams, and maybe throw me a follow on Twitch to know when I'm live. Until the next one, peace.